Hi, and welcome to my workshop on understanding autism and effective communication. My name is Dr Emma Goodall, and I'm an autism consultant and a teacher and a researcher. I'm also on the autistic spectrum. I have Asperger's. As part of my research, I was looking at contextual factors of teaching students on the autistic spectrum. I discovered that the way that people on the spectrum think and interpret and interact with the world is very different from the way that people who are not on the spectrum think and interact with the world. One of these differences is encapsulated in the cartoon below. For those of us on the autistic spectrum, we are either utterly obsessed with something, in which case our brain works overtime, or we're completely uninterested, in which case we don't engage. Before we start, I'd just like to take a moment to talk about verbal skills and people on the autistic spectrum. In the bad old days, hopefully they're all gone, children on the autistic spectrum who did not speak were given diagnoses of intellectual disability, carte blanche, without further testing. Many of these children do go on to learn speech, however some don't, and it is very important to note that verbal skills do not equate to cognitive skills. There is no relationship, and verbal skills can fluctuate within one person so that they can be fluent in their speech at some times, but when they're stressed or overwhelmed in their environment, lose most or all of their speech. In addition, many non-verbal autistic adults have demonstrated that they can not only read, but type meaningful conversations, narratives, novels, poetry, etc. Being autistic is not about having or seeing the world through half full, half empty. It's very much more about being autistically different. We do think, speak, do and be differently than people who are not on the spectrum. In our interaction with the world, for those of us on the spectrum, we're interacting in the way that's normal for us, but it is different than the way that other people do. This is because we hear, see, taste, smell, touch and feel differently to people who are not on the spectrum. Recent research, for example, has indicated that autistic people's senses, including sensing emotion, is more acute than that of other people. These two pictures illustrate the detail with which we see, hear, touch, etc. and interact with the world and respond to it. Over the last few years, there's been quite a lot of research into the differences that gender has in the autistic spectrum. We've gone from thinking only 1 in 10 people on the autistic spectrum were female to perhaps as many as half, but certainly 1 in 4 is talked about a lot. One of the reasons that fewer girls are diagnosed is that girls seem to be able to mask their difficulties more easily, and also there are some differences in the way that girls express themselves when they're on the spectrum from boys. For example, Tony Attwood has suggested that girls can use media and observe situations to watch and learn and take on board expected behaviours. This means that they can seem socially skilled as they're actually using rules to decide what they should do in which particular place. One of the outcomes of this is that if you look in the playground, the girls are playing and joining in, however they're usually instigating and controlling games. Whereas boys are often sidelined in the playground, and it's more obvious that they're on the autistic spectrum. This is because Attwood reports that boys don't seem to learn from media or observed situations, and that they need explicit teaching. For example, they will reproduce computer violence in the playground unless taught explicitly that they shouldn't do this. In general, the autistic brain is hyperlogical, and when people on the spectrum learn language initially, they understand it very literally, and each idiom is learnt one by one. For example, it's raining cats and dogs is learnt quite quickly, that it really isn't raining cats and dogs, and this means it's raining quite heavily. Other idioms are more difficult to understand and take longer to learn. One of the side effects of being very logical and literal is that autistic children particularly interpret all questions logically. And this can be problematic in a classroom or in the home when you're trying to look at what exactly the child understands. One of the reasons it's quite difficult to decide what autistic children understand is that being on the spectrum takes a huge amount of energy and brain processing power. And as a result, we don't want to waste even more brain processing power doing things that we perceive as pointless. So when you've read a story with a student or your child and you ask them what happens in the story, logically, this is a completely pointless question because you should already know what happened in the story because you read it too. If you put this into the autistic context, there's a physical environment and then there's a noise component of the environment, for example. And then there's the other people in the environment, and then there's all the emotions inherent in the environment. And put all together, this can create that moment on a fairly constant basis for many autistic spectrum students and adults. And the way to diminish the context is to make fewer demands or have fewer sensory inputs, or to ensure that the demands are interesting and engaging for the student. Because of the type of sensory input that those of us on the autistic spectrum have, we develop sensory sensitivities, which I'll explain in a moment, fixations, and these can lead to overload and meltdowns. Overloads and meltdowns look like fight or flight. Sensory sensitivities are interesting because autistic people are either overly sensitive or underly sensitive, or a mixture of two. And you can be oversensitive to taste and undersensitive to texture, or you can be oversensitive to certain tastes and undersensitive to other tastes. Our sensory sensitivity leads us to either avoid or seek sensory experiences, and this is because some sensory experiences are felt as painful or traumatic, whereas others are calming or pleasurable. Apart from the usual senses of taste, touch, noise, smell and sight, emotional sensitivity and vestibular sensory experiences are also part of the sensory profile for people on the autistic spectrum. When we experience sensory sensitivities, issues can present when we suddenly start yelling and screaming or express noticeable distress. These should never be assumed to be behavioural responses in terms of being naughty or bad behaviour, and the sensory environment should be checked first. What is the light like? What is the noise level like, or the pressure? Somebody just touched them in a way they don't like. Have they just experienced a revolting taste that for people not on the autistic spectrum would result in a yuck, but for somebody on the autistic spectrum may result in a screaming fit? Some people on the spectrum will withdraw themselves or physically remove the object from close to them or the sensory input. Others will appear agitated, some will cover ears or eyes. Many children run away initially, and others will sit and rock. Fixations are very interesting. Whenever I do workshops with teachers, they talk to me about fixations of their students on the spectrum on particular activities, or they'll filter sand through their fingers for hours. And for me, that's actually a sensory activity rather than a fixation, and it's a self-calming or a stimming activity that the child is enjoying. Fixations can be thoughts, things, or activities. They can be helpful, useful, problematic, or a combination of the two. Fixations on activities or objects tend to diminish or change over time during childhood, and they can become fixed in adulthood, whereas fixated thoughts tend to stay the same unless they're proven wrong. Another area around fixations is the fixation on routine. And it used to be thought that everybody on the spectrum had to have routine, and we'd all freak out if we didn't have routine. However, psychologists and psychiatrists are beginning to understand that a need for routine is not really what it's about. It's actually a need for control or understanding over our world, because our world is so intense. However, where children have been brought up with very strict routines, their need for routine can become entrenched. And this means a child with autism will have a meltdown whenever the routine is changed, which causes lots of difficulties. In any case, you should always signal changes in advance, both verbally and visually. Explain why a change is happening and what will happen next. Control or understanding is far more important for most people on the spectrum than a need for routine. However, some people do need that routine. Routine for the rest of us is merely an easy way to have that control or understanding. If at all possible, prevent a dependence on routine from occurring by varying things within day-to-day life from early infancy. One of the fixated thoughts that is really problematic is when someone on the autistic spectrum, particularly a child, decides that another person, particularly their teacher, doesn't like them. And this thought is very rarely if ever changed. So you need to prevent this at all costs, or you're going to end up having to change classrooms or even schools. You can prevent this kind of thought from occurring if the first meeting that's set up with a new teacher is calm, warm, respectful and considerate, and hopefully the teacher will agree to mention your child's special interest, which should be used to introduce new topics and skills during the first few months of school or the first few months working with a new teacher. The need for control is also linked to our autistic desire to complete tasks and to do this perfectly. Unfortunately, school doesn't tend to allow perfectionism or value it, whereas university and workplaces do value these traits highly. However, it's not possible for autistic students to be perfectionists one second and not perfectionists the other. So you need to challenge perfectionism by deciding if it's always okay not to be perfect. It's no good wanting perfect handwriting today and it can be alright tomorrow. Instead of requiring perfection visually, set boundaries by time or other defined statuses. For example, writing one page, writing for half an hour, washing all the dishes once only. But then you can't point out the errors. You need to thank the person for doing what they were asked and model learning through trial and error. Routines and interests can act as self-regulation emotionally and mentally, and they can create an understandable world for people on the spectrum. They can be viewed as problematic by others, generally when they require flexibility. And it has to be said, what is logical about flexibility? It really is only poor planning. Routines and interests can be used to acquire new skills or knowledge in a stress-free manner. It can be used to create bonds and trust. Don't forget, what's routine for one person is not for another and won't be required at all for another. Meltdowns are like huge volcanic explosions. If you try and pour concrete in the top of a volcano, you may manage to plug it, highly unlikely, but in the event that you did, the volcano would burst open at the side and the lava would still explode. And this is what a meltdown is like. A meltdown is completely uncontrollable. Once it's started, it just has to run its course. It's generally caused by overload and triggered by a seminal event or sensory input that literally was the final straw and the person could not cope anymore. It takes time, space and sensory regulation to resolve a meltdown and to be able to integrate back into activities again. Tantrums, on the other hand, are controllable and they tend to be caused by not getting their own way. Tantrums require firm management, clear behavioural boundaries. For example, if a student hits other people when they're having a tantrum and they're 5, you've got 11 years before it becomes illegal for them to be hitting other people. So you need to remember that and work out how to support them to express themselves in a more appropriate manner. Meltdowns and tantrums do tend to happen all throughout our life. They can become less frequent as we get older, and we learn to self-regulate and self-manage ourselves better. It's far easier to prevent a meltdown than it is to try and interrupt one. In fact, it's almost impossible to stop a meltdown once it's in progress. It just has to run its course. And this is the case no matter how a meltdown manifests. I always say it's much like having a volcano explode. You can't plug the top and hope it's not going to burst out through the sides. Prevention of meltdowns is through sensory management, clear communication, facilitation of clear and accepted routines or self-control of the environment for the person, and time to enjoy special interests. After a meltdown, you need to give the person time and space to self-regulate themselves. For some people, movement is really useful. However, others need to have a quiet space, and yet others a specific type of noise. If it's an adult, they may know how to self-regulate. For a child, you might have to help them learn how. Language and communication for people on the autistic spectrum is different from those who are not on the spectrum because we have a very literal understanding of spoken and written language and quite minimal understanding of body language, especially as children. Many people on the spectrum are also slower processors of language or find it hard to process multi-part instructions, especially if there are other sensory inputs going on at the same time, for example, background noise or the lights are flickering or people are pushing them and shoving them. Tony Atwood reports that girls and women compensate for language difficulties far better than boys. People with Asperger's often appear to have perfect communication, although other autistic spectrum people can too. However, it's not the case. When talking to a person with autism, you need to make sure you gain their attention first because they won't necessarily know that you're talking to them because they hear all noise that's going on around and find it very difficult to filter which noise is the important noise to listen to. You need to use clear language, say what you mean and mean what you say, and if this is the only thing you remember from this talk, please, when you're talking to people on the autistic spectrum, say what you mean and mean what you say. Written lists, visual schedules can be useful tools for many people on the spectrum. Also remember that most communication is social in nature, and that's why it's problematic for people who have little understanding of or use for social norms. Tact, for example, is often expected in many cultures, but it needs to be specifically taught because tact is in fact a lie, and we need to teach autistic spectrum children who are required to be tactful when it's okay to lie and call it tact, and when it's not okay to lie and it's called a lie. Social niceties, so etiquette, politeness, are really important. They can make children, young people and adults more accepted by their peers and communities, and these can be very easily taught and learnt, but quite often aren't. One of the interesting things about speaking the same language as somebody else is that it's presumed that we all have shared meanings. However, our meanings may be quite different, and they may be shared within the autistic community and not between the autistic community and the non-autistic community. For example, very few of you would think to stand on the overhead projector should your teacher have told you this as a child. I and many other people on the spectrum did think we should stand on the overhead projector. There are a few common issues around communication in the education setting, which teachers often bring up when I work with them. For example, John doesn't respond when I say his name. And John is listening to all the noises that are going on around him, and he may not understand that when you say his name, it means you want his attention. So you have to say what you mean. John, please listen. John, pay attention. And over time, you can teach that whenever John's name is said, that he is meant to pay attention or listen. Another one is when children don't answer social greetings appropriately. For example, when they come to school in the morning and the teacher says, "Hi Sarah," or "Hello Sarah," and Sarah doesn't say anything back. Sarah is not necessarily being rude, she just doesn't necessarily know that the teacher wants her to say hello back, and so this needs to be taught. Another issue is around responses in general. So for example, when I ask questions, Tahu doesn't say anything. And this is very interesting because I always answer a question very, very quickly, regardless of whether or not my answer is vaguely sensible, because I know that people think I'm more intelligent if I answer questions quickly, and I think I'm intelligent, so I want them to think I'm intelligent. However, some children are very careful in their processing, and they want to A, understand the question properly, and B, come up with an appropriate response. And this can take time. It can take up to 30 seconds, and teachers very rarely allow more than 5 to 10 seconds before rephrasing the question, which then starts the whole processing again and just ends up confusing the child. So please, if you're an adult working with a child or adult on the spectrum who has auditory processing difficulties, just allow 30 seconds for a response before rephrasing your question more clearly. 30 seconds is a long time. Try timing it the first couple of times you do it. There are a number of strategies that are useful for effective communication with people on the autistic spectrum. I've used the word student here because this is very pertinent for teachers, but it can also apply to families and to adults. The first thing to do is minimize other sensory input that the person is experiencing. Gain their attention, and when you have got their attention, speak in short, precise sentences and or share visuals with the person. Be specific about what you're communicating. If the person can read, write down what you're saying and leave for the student to reference, or you can leave the visuals with them. The other thing that you need to do when you're trying to communicate effectively with someone on the spectrum, and this is about a classroom, but it could be any environment, is that the rest of the class need to be physically still, mostly. The class also need to be quiet, and that's not just voices, it's other noises. That scratching noise that kids do, or the banging of the feet. Flickering lights can be hugely distracting, they need to be turned off. And students shouldn't be in physical contact with one another due to sensory sensitivities around touch. To gain the student's attention, you need to stand close to the student. Now, the next point, there are a few people on the spectrum who do not like being touched gently but are okay with a firm touch, and there are a few that do not like to be touched at all. So you need to check out with your student first. If they do want to be touched, they're okay with being touched, then touch them in the manner that they prefer. I have found that most of the people I work with are quite happy with a gentle touch on their arm or shoulder, whilst I say the student's name quietly and calmly, and then I say, "Listen now." It's really important to understand students and adults on the spectrum do not need to look at you to listen to you. And for some people on the spectrum, eye contact actually removes the ability to listen and process. Once you've gained a person's attention, then you need to speak in short, precise sentences. Of course, you'll notice I don't. I'm one of those people on the spectrum that never stops talking. However, when working with other people or children on the spectrum, I do speak in short, precise sentences. It needs to be done using a calm and relatively quiet voice, because the louder the voice, the more sensory input that is coming in, and the more distracting just the loudness is rather than the actual content. If you speak in one phrase sentences, those students and adults who can only process one phrase at a time will be able to understand you. So, for example, open up your books and then wait for compliance and then say, write today's date. Once that's done, you can give the instruction about the task. For example, think about the genre and then give some time for that. Read your worksheet. Once the worksheet's been read, answer the worksheet questions in your book. Put your hand up if you have a question. You need to be very specific. Again, this was the point I stressed. You need to say exactly what you mean and mean exactly what you say. Many people say in 5 minutes, and they don't really mean 5 minutes. They mean when I'm ready or when I think you're ready, somewhere between 1 and 10 minutes. You can use all those things instead. If you say in 5 minutes and it's 2 or 10, the student ends up thinking you don't know how to tell the time, which implies that you're not as clever as they are because they can tell the time. This is not a thought train you want to set up. In addition, if somebody does have some language difficulties, do not use double negatives. It's very confusing and results in all kinds of issues. You need to focus on essential details. For example, when you say write a few sentences, what do you mean by a few? So I would be sitting there along with some of my autistic spectrum colleagues or students, and we'd all be thinking, well, is a few 2, is it 3, is it 4? And we would get fixated on that instead of actually writing. If you mean write 2, somewhere between 2 and 10 sentences, you can say that. Or say to the autistic spectrum student, write 3 sentences, whatever you want. When you say think about, do you want those thoughts presented on paper or expressed verbally? You need to say so, because for those of us on the spectrum, think about means a process that's in our head and does not get externalized. One helpful tip is writing down what you're saying. So when you're giving those single-step instructions, you can write it down and leave it for the student beside them. This is because students with language difficulties can struggle to hold language in their working memory and process it fast enough to comply quickly. A written prompt means that they can focus their energy on complying with the instructions and not trying to spend the energy holding words in their head and processing. In addition, students with dyspraxia and or dyslexia can really struggle to hold written information from the board in their head whilst turning their head and their bodies to look at their work. So having the notes right next to them can avoid this issue. Now, we all know teachers are very important. However, the impact of a teacher on a student on the spectrum can be massive, both positively and negatively. It can ruin a child's life, or it can set the child up to go on and achieve great things. This is because of our fixated thoughts. So one word or sentence from a teacher, or in fact a parent, anybody, can affect an autistic child for years and years or their entire life. Children and adults on the spectrum will comply to make you happy if they think you like them, but conversely, if they think you don't like them, they won't do anything at all for you. And this has big ramifications in a school. These are some examples of single-step instructions, because a number of teachers have said, yes, I know what a single-step instruction is, and then I'll do an observation and they'll be doing multi-step instructions. So multi-step instructions would be where you join some of these together, and single-step instructions is where you say each line and then you wait for the person to have done that before giving the next instruction. So I'll just let you read those. Alex, come here. Joe, sit down. Lisa, stop writing. Tahu, open up your book. Tahu, write the date. Tahu, look at this picture. Tahu, write 2 sentences about this picture. The issue of compliance is quite different for people on the autistic spectrum than for people who are not. There is a whole social hierarchy which comes into play apparently when talking about compliance. So a teacher will, for example, presume that all children in their class should comply simply because they are the teacher and the children must do what teachers say. In addition, for example, the principal is more important than the teacher, so the principal says something different from the teacher, the student should comply with the principal. And if a peer says something and a teacher says something different, the student should comply with the teacher. Now, people on the autistic spectrum may or may not have that social awareness. However, we're not interested in those societal roles because generally there is a belief that everybody and everything is equal. An animal is equal to a person, all people are equal in their value and their worth. Then you get that added difficulty that when parents or teachers ask a child to do something which the autistic spectrum child perceives as pointless or boring or stupid, they don't have that social interest in doing what you say just because society expects them to do. So you need to often justify or explain your rationale requests. And if you use clear logical explanations, this will get you a long way. I do accept it is hugely helpful to work on the idea that some things just have to be done regardless, as this will help the child to succeed at school. For example, saying please and thank you, taking turns. Which leads me on to the importance of friends. Please and thank you are social niceties, and people tend to like people more if they're socially nice. And when I was training to be a teacher and first learning about autism, I was told that people on the autistic spectrum didn't need friends, they didn't want friends. And I had always only really had one friend at a time all the way through school, and I think I had 2 through university, so that was quite exciting. But they were in different spheres of my life. And what I've come to understand through talking with lots of other adults on the autistic spectrum and lots of children on the autistic spectrum is that our idea of friendship is quite different. So if we go back to the point that people with autism think logically, we like to plan and structure pretty much everything. And it comes down to the fact that social skills aren't logical. That thing of tact is lying. So social situations are anxiety provoking. But at the same time, people with autism do usually want to have friends. We want that time to share our interests with other people. However, we keep friends to a minimum. We want to share interests with people and time together because we want to. Other definitions of friendship can include social emotional expectations, such as being there when your friends need support. And people with autism may or may not place importance on these social expectations. They may, however, place expectations on things like having phone calls returned. If a person with autism is told, I'll give you a call tonight, and you don't call that person, they will then presume that you don't like them. And if a person with autism doesn't feel liked or respected by the other person, they're unlikely to interact positively or at all in many cases. And some people with autism are super sensitive to the emotions of others or places, and this can impact on their friendships as well. One of the things that's quite interesting is the perception by society in general that people on the autistic spectrum, kids, teens, adults, are odd, different, bit weird, quirky, all those kinds of things. But when you look at it from the teenager's point of view, when they're on the spectrum, and I was just like this, even though I didn't have a diagnosis, they say things like, well, I'm logical and you know, the other kids in my class aren't, so they're the idiots. In the north of England, in the winter, where I spent some time as a teenager, it's very, very cold, and most teenage girls go out in a miniskirt and high heels, and it's freezing, and I could never understand why they did this. I would be wearing boots, jeans, jacket, several jumpers, hat, gloves, scarf, and I would be told that I was odd or I wasn't doing the right thing, and people didn't want to hang out with me if I wasn't dressed right. And the teenagers that I talk to say, well, I wear what's right for the weather, what's practical. You know, if I'm going to be doing something on the farm, I want to be wearing my gumboots. If I'm going into town, I'm going to be walking, I want sensible shoes. Those other teens that wearing the miniskirts, they're the odd ones. And what it comes down to is, I am me. My normality is me. Therefore, I am normal. You, however, are not me. You're different, and therefore it's you that's different. And so we really need to reconcile these two things so that we can understand that, yes, we're different, but that doesn't mean less than. It just means different. And so we need to find a collaborative way of working between people who are and people who are not on the autistic spectrum. We need to meet in the middle. And one of the things about doing this is that the problem is only really a problem when there is a problem. And what normally happens is that the teacher, for example, will say, well, the student isn't doing X, Y, or Z, and I need them to do X, Y, or Z. And for me, it's the teacher's problem, but the teacher is seeing it as the problem inherent in the student quite often. So we need to problem solve differently. We need to look at the issue from both points of view, the teacher's point of view, yours, and the autistic student's point of view. Why is there an issue? What are the desired outcomes for you? And what outcome is acceptable to the person with autism? And how do you get from here to those outcomes? So here's an example. The teacher's view was that H was unable to sit quietly in class, and they really wanted H to sit still and be quiet because this is how it should be. I questioned whether or not H sitting quietly and still would result in H doing any work. H's view, so he's on the autistic spectrum, was that he worked best when he was moving around, and that the rest of the class made noise all the time, so why couldn't he move around? He felt that it would be acceptable to move around all the time except when he was writing, and okay, he could compromise and he could write sitting down when he was working. The solution we came up with was that he could use a sit and go cushion, which allowed him to move constantly while sitting down, but he was also given regular movement breaks, particularly in those thinking periods before writing, and that the rest of the class were not talking incessantly. This was an issue of fairness for H. He felt that he should be able to move if they were making noise. And the teacher, when she thought about it, could see from his point of view how that would be unfair and chose to address that. Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to read more on this or anything else that I write about positively and autism, have a look at my blog at healthypossibilities.net. This talk has been vastly expanded in my book, Understanding and Facilitating the Achievement of Autistic Potential, which is available on Amazon. So once again, thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions, please let me know.